Have you ever wondered what happens when love blooms in the shadow of war machines? When the very factories built to defeat fascism become the backdrop for the most dangerous romance imaginable? Picture this. It's 1943, Detroit, Michigan. The city that would become the arsenal of democracy is working around the clock churning out tanks, aircraft engines, and ammunition. But inside one particular factory, something extraordinary is about to unfold. Something that will challenge everything you think you know about love during wartime. Tonight, I'm going to take you inside the Willow Run plant, where rivets flew like sparks and hearts collided against all odds. This isn't just another war story. This is the tale of Margaret Sullivan and Klaus Vber, two people who should have been enemies, who should have never met, whose very existence in the same space defied every law of wartime America. What makes this story so incredible isn't just the romance itself. It's how their forbidden love unfolded in plain sight, hidden among the deafening roar of machinery and the constant threat of air raid sirens. Every stolen glance was an act of treason. Every whispered word could have meant death. Yet somehow, against impossible odds, they found each other in the most unlikely place imaginable. I spent months researching this account, diving deep into factory records, personal diaries, and testimonies that have been buried for over 80 years. What I discovered was a love story so dangerous, so heart-stopping, that it reads like fiction. But every detail is real. Every heart-pounding moment of terror, every second of stolen happiness, every impossible choice they faced actually happened. Before we dive into their extraordinary story, let me paint you a picture of just how impossible their situation really was. Margaret Sullivan was 24 years old, working the night shift at Willow Run. She was one of thousands of women who had taken jobs in defense plants, trading their domestic lives for the chance to serve their country on the home front. Her husband had shipped out to the Pacific Theater 6 months earlier, and she hadn't heard from him in weeks. Klaus Vber was 26. A German prisoner of war assigned to factory labor under heavy guard. He had been captured during the North African campaign and transported to a detention camp outside Detroit, where prisoners were put to work in essential industries. By every rule of war, by every social expectation of the time, Margaret and Klaus were supposed to be mortal enemies. Their first meeting wasn't romantic, it wasn't planned. It was a moment of pure chance that could have ended in tragedy for both of them. Margaret had been working the assembly line, installing electrical systems in bomber engines, when a piece of machinery malfunctioned. Sparks flew, alarms sounded, and in the chaos that followed, she found herself face to face with a man in prison work clothes who had rushed to help shut down the dangerous equipment. For a split second, their eyes met across the factory floor. The noise around them seemed to fade into nothing. Two human beings, caught in an impossible moment, seeing something unexpected in each other's gaze. Margaret saw not an enemy prisoner, but someone who had risked his own safety to prevent her from being hurt. Klaus saw not an American factory worker, but a woman whose courage in continuing to work despite the sparking machinery impressed him deeply. That moment should have ended there. Klaus should have returned to his supervised work detail. Margaret should have reported the incident to her supervisor. Instead, something passed between them that neither could explain or ignore. A recognition that went deeper than nationality. Deeper than the war that had torn their worlds apart. The Willow Run plant was a marvel of American industrial might. Stretching over 3 million square feet, it was the largest factory building in the world at the time. Henry Ford had designed it to mass-produce B-24 Liberator bombers, rolling them off the assembly line like automobiles. The factory operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with 3 shifts of workers who rarely saw daylight. It was also a fortress of security. Armed guards patrolled every entrance. Workers carried identification badges that were checked multiple times per shift. Prisoner of war laborers were kept under constant supervision, their movements restricted to specific areas of the plant. The entire facility was surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers, a constant reminder that this was wartime and vigilance was essential. Yet somehow, in this most controlled of environments, Margaret and Klaus began to find ways to see each other. It started innocently enough. Margaret would volunteer for maintenance duty in sections where prisoner work details were assigned. Klaus would linger near areas where he might catch a glimpse of her during shift changes. They never spoke during these early encounters, but their awareness of each other grew with each passing day. The factory's constant noise provided perfect cover for their growing connection. The roar of machinery, the hiss of pneumatic tools, and the clatter of assembly lines created a wall of sound that made private conversation possible even in crowded spaces. Margaret learned Klaus's work schedule by observing the patterns of guard rotations. Klaus memorized the rhythm of Margaret's movements through the factory floor. Their first real conversation took place 3 weeks after their initial meeting. Margaret had been assigned to inspect electrical work in a section where Klaus was helping to install engine mounts. The guard supervising his detail had stepped away to deal with a problem elsewhere, leaving the prisoners to work under the distant observation of factory supervisors. Klaus was struggling with a particularly stubborn bolt when Margaret approached with her inspection clipboard. She could have simply noted the work and moved on. Instead, she quietly pointed out that the bolt was cross-threaded and showed him how to back it out without damaging the mounting plate. Their hands touched briefly as she guided his grip on the wrench, and both felt an electric shock that had nothing to do with the factory's machinery. They spoke in whispers, their conversation lasting only minutes before the guard returned. But in those precious moments, they learned each other's names. Klaus told her he had been a teacher before the war, that he had never wanted to be a soldier. Margaret shared that she was married to a man she barely knew, someone her parents had chosen for her before the war changed everything. The danger of their situation was immediate and overwhelming. Klaus faced summary execution if caught fraternizing with American civilians. Margaret could be charged with treason for communicating with an enemy prisoner. Both understood that their growing attraction was not just forbidden, but potentially fatal. Yet neither could stop thinking about those whispered moments in the factory's controlled chaos. Margaret found herself volunteering for increasingly dangerous assignments that would bring her into Klaus's work areas. Klaus began taking risks that could have resulted in severe punishment, lingering in places where he might encounter her during shift changes. The factory became their secret world, a place where the war felt distant despite the constant production of weapons designed to defeat Klaus's homeland. Among the half-assembled bombers and massive engine blocks, they discovered something alive and growing. They talked about books they had read, dreams they had harbored before the war changed everything, the kind of world they hoped might exist when the madness finally ended. Klaus brought her small gifts he crafted from factory scraps during his off hours. A flower made from twisted wire and metal shavings. A tiny bird carved from a piece of wood he had found in the shipping area. These tokens were more dangerous than weapons, evidence of a connection that could destroy them both. Margaret began bringing Klaus extra food from her lunch pail, sharing rations with someone who was supposed to be her enemy. She learned basic German phrases to better communicate with him during their stolen moments. Klaus taught her the names of flowers in his language, whispering translations that sounded like poetry against the backdrop of industrial noise. The other workers began to notice Margaret's behavior, her distraction during routine tasks, the way she seemed to glow with an inner light that had nothing to do with the harsh factory lighting. Klaus's fellow prisoners observed his improved mood, his willingness to take on extra work assignments, the hope that had replaced the despair they had all carried since their capture. Their secret was becoming visible to eyes trained to detect exactly this kind of security breach. Guards started paying closer attention to prisoner interactions with civilian workers. Supervisors began questioning unusual work requests and assignment changes. The walls were closing in around a love that had grown beyond their ability to control or conceal. As winter approached Detroit, bringing shorter days and longer shifts at the factory, Margaret and Klaus both understood that their borrowed time was running out. The investigation that would either expose their dangerous romance or somehow allow it to survive was already beginning, though neither knew how close they were to discovery. The question that haunted them both was devastatingly simple. How far would they go to protect what they had found in the shadows of America's greatest war machine? And what would they be willing to sacrifice to keep their impossible love alive in a world determined to tear them apart? The air raid sirens that tested Detroit's defenses every week had become the soundtrack to their romance. But soon, those same sirens would announce the arrival of investigators whose job was to root out exactly the kind of connection that had bloomed between a lonely American factory worker and a German prisoner of war who had found something worth risking everything to preserve. The investigation began on a Tuesday morning in December when Supervisor Bill Henderson noticed something that made his blood run cold. Margaret Sullivan had volunteered for hazardous duty assignments 17 times in the past month, all in sections where German prisoners were working. This wasn't dedication to the war effort. This was a pattern that could only mean one thing. Henderson had been running factory security at Willow Run since the plant opened, and he had developed an instinct for detecting trouble before it exploded into something that could shut down production or compromise national security. He'd seen workers smuggle out factory secrets, witnessed sabotage attempts by enemy sympathizers, and dealt with labor disputes that threatened to cripple America's war machine. But this was different. This felt personal and infinitely more dangerous. He started keeping detailed notes on Margaret's movements, tracking her work requests against prisoner assignments with the methodical precision of a man who understood that one security breach could cost thousands of American lives. What he discovered over the next week made him reach for his telephone to call military intelligence. Margaret had requested assignments in Building C on every day that Prisoner Detail 14 was scheduled to work there. She had volunteered for overtime shifts that coincided exactly with extended prisoner work periods. Most damning of all, she had been observed in conversation with prisoners on multiple occasions, interactions that lasted far longer than necessary for work-related communication. Klaus, meanwhile, was facing his own scrutiny from an unexpected source. His fellow prisoners had noticed his transformation from the broken man who had arrived at the detention camp 6 months earlier. He smiled now, hummed while working, and displayed an energy that seemed impossible given their circumstances. This change had not gone unnoticed by prison guards, who were trained to recognize signs of escape planning or resistance organization. Sergeant Murphy, the senior guard responsible for Klaus's work detail, had fought in the First War and understood that enemy prisoners could be deceptive in ways that threatened everyone around them. He began watching Klaus with the suspicious eye of someone who had seen too many good soldiers die because they underestimated their captives. The sergeant started documenting Klaus's behavior patterns, noting his requests to work specific assignments and his apparent familiarity with certain areas of the factory that weren't part of his authorized duties. When Murphy reviewed his notes, a disturbing picture emerged of a prisoner who seemed to know far more about Willow Run's operations than security protocols should have allowed. The convergence of these two investigations was inevitable, though neither Henderson nor Murphy initially realized they were tracking the same security breach from different angles. It wasn't until Margaret requested assignment to a night maintenance crew in the same week that Klaus volunteered for extended evening work duty that the pieces began falling into place. The trap they were walking into had been months in the making, built from small decisions and tiny risks that had accumulated into something that would soon explode across both their lives. Every stolen moment, every whispered conversation, every lingering glance had been observed by someone whose job was to prevent exactly what was happening between them. December brought bitter cold to Detroit, and the factory's heating system struggled to warm the massive space where America's bomber fleet took shape. Workers bundled in extra layers, their breath visible in the frigid air as they assembled the instruments of war that would carry freedom across the Atlantic and Pacific. For Margaret and Klaus, the cold provided new opportunities for contact. Workers huddled together around heating units during breaks, creating natural gathering points where conversations could develop without attracting attention. Klaus learned to time his movements to coincide with Margaret's breaks, positioning himself near heating stations where she might seek warmth during the brief respites from assembly line work. Their conversations grew more intimate as they shared the universal human need for warmth in the factory's harsh environment. Klaus told Margaret about winters on his family's farm in Bavaria, describing snow-covered fields and cozy evenings by fires that seemed impossibly distant from their current reality. Margaret shared memories of Michigan winters from her childhood, skating parties and sledding expeditions that belonged to a world before the war changed everything. They began planning their conversations more carefully, developing a simple code system that allowed them to communicate basic information about when and where they might be able to meet. Klaus would leave small marks on machinery that indicated his work assignments for the following day. Margaret would respond with her own signals, using chalk marks on inspection sheets that told him where she would be conducting quality control reviews. The system worked for 3 weeks, allowing them to coordinate brief encounters that felt like stolen lifetimes. They would stand close together while examining engine mounts, their hands touching as they pointed out technical details that provided cover for more personal exchanges. Klaus would whisper German phrases that Margaret had learned to understand, words of endearment that sounded like technical terminology to anyone who might overhear. But their code system was also creating the documented evidence that would ultimately destroy them. Every mark Klaus made was being photographed by security personnel who had been alerted to watch for signs of sabotage or intelligence gathering. Every notation Margaret added to inspection reports was being copied and analyzed by investigators who were building a case that would soon reach the highest levels of military command. The breakthrough in the investigation came when Henderson and Murphy compared their surveillance notes and realized they were tracking complementary patterns that could only indicate one thing. A romantic relationship had developed between an American defense worker and a German prisoner of war, a security breach so serious that it threatened the integrity of the entire Willow Run operation. Henderson immediately contacted FBI agents who specialized in wartime counterintelligence, while Murphy notified his military superiors about a potential espionage situation that required immediate intervention. Within hours, Margaret and Klaus had unknowingly become the subjects of a joint federal investigation that would determine not just their personal fates, but the security protocols for every defense plant in America. The investigators who descended on Willow Run brought with them technologies and techniques that made the routine factory security look primitive by comparison. Hidden cameras were installed to monitor prisoner work areas. Microphones were placed near heating stations and other gathering points where workers congregated during breaks. Every conversation, every gesture, every moment of eye contact was being recorded and analyzed by experts who understood that love could be the most dangerous weapon of war. Margaret sensed the change in atmosphere before she understood its cause. Guards seemed more attentive, supervisors asked more questions about work assignments, and her fellow workers began treating her with a distance that felt like suspicion. She tried to convince herself that the tension was simply a result of increased production pressures as the war entered what everyone hoped would be its final phase. Klaus felt the surveillance more acutely, recognizing the signs from his military training and his experience as a prisoner who had learned to read the moods of his captors. He noticed guards positioning themselves differently during work periods, observed new personnel who seemed to be watching rather than working, and detected the subtle changes in routine that indicated heightened security measures. Both understood instinctively that their secret was no longer secret, though neither knew the extent of the investigation that was building around them. They began taking greater precautions during their encounters, limiting their conversations to the most essential exchanges and avoiding the lingering looks that had become so precious to them both. But it was already too late. The evidence had been gathered, the patterns documented, and the decisions made at levels of authority that neither Margaret nor Klaus could influence or appeal. The love they had found in the shadow of war machines was about to face the full weight of a system designed to crush anything that threatened America's victory in the greatest conflict in human history. The air raid sirens that had provided the soundtrack to their romance would soon announce something far more devastating than any enemy attack. They would signal the arrival of federal agents whose job was to determine whether love between enemies constituted treason and what price two hearts would pay for choosing each other over the loyalty their nations demanded. Demanded. The federal agents arrived at Willow Run on a Monday morning disguised as quality control inspectors from the War Production Board. Special Agent Sarah Chen had spent the weekend studying every piece of evidence that Henderson and Murphy had compiled, constructing a timeline that revealed the systematic development of what appeared to be the most dangerous security breach in defense plant history. Chen understood that this case would set precedents for how wartime romance was handled across every factory, shipyard, and military installation in America. The implications went far beyond two individuals who had fallen in love against impossible odds. This was about maintaining the psychological barriers that kept America's war machine functioning at peak efficiency. Her partner, Agent Robert Morrison, brought 15 years of counterintelligence experience to an investigation that felt unlike anything he had encountered during his career. Most espionage cases involved deliberate betrayal motivated by ideology or money. This situation presented something far more complex and potentially more dangerous because it appeared to be driven by genuine emotion rather than calculated treachery. The agents began their surveillance by observing morning shift changes, watching as thousands of workers streamed through security checkpoints with the mechanical efficiency of people who had performed the same routine for months. Margaret arrived at her usual time, 7:45, carrying the metal lunch pail that had become as familiar to Klaus as his own heartbeat. Klaus entered the factory 20 minutes later as part of prisoner detail 14, his movements carefully observed by guards who now understood they were watching someone capable of compromising national security through the simple act of falling in love with the wrong person. The agents positioned themselves at strategic points throughout the factory floor, using equipment that could record conversations from distances that made detection nearly impossible. Every word Margaret and Klaus exchanged would be transcribed, analyzed, and evaluated for evidence of intelligence sharing or sabotage coordination. What they discovered during their first day of intensive surveillance surprised both experienced investigators. The conversations between Margaret and Klaus revealed no discussion of factory secrets, no exchange of technical information, no coordination of activities that could compromise production or security. Instead, they overheard whispered exchanges about poetry, shared memories of peacetime life, and the kind of intimate personal revelations that characterized people falling deeply in love. Agent Chen found herself unexpectedly moved by recordings of Klaus describing his mother's garden to Margaret, his voice filled with homesickness for a world that no longer existed. Agent Morrison was struck by Margaret's confession that she had married her husband without loving him, that Klaus represented the first genuine connection she had ever felt with another human being. But personal sympathy could not override professional responsibility. The agents understood that love between enemies during wartime created vulnerabilities that hostile forces could exploit in ways that threatened everyone. Klaus might be innocent of deliberate espionage, but his emotional attachment to Margaret made him a potential asset for German intelligence operations that could cost thousands of American lives. The investigation expanded to include detailed background checks on both subjects. Military intelligence reviewed Klaus's service record, interrogated fellow prisoners who might have knowledge of his activities, and analyzed every letter he had written or received since his capture. FBI agents interviewed Margaret's neighbors, co-workers, and family members, building a comprehensive profile of someone who appeared to have no previous history of disloyalty or suspicious behavior. What emerged from this intensive scrutiny was a picture of two ordinary people who had been swept up in circumstances beyond their control or understanding. Klaus had been a reluctant soldier conscripted into service for a cause he questioned. Margaret was a patriotic American who had taken a defense job to support the war effort, while her husband served overseas. Neither fit the profile of someone likely to commit treason, yet both had created a situation that threatened the security protocols essential to America's victory. The investigators faced the unprecedented challenge of determining whether love itself could constitute an act of war. Meanwhile, Margaret and Klaus continued their carefully orchestrated encounters, unaware that every gesture was being documented by agents who were building a case that would soon tear their world apart. They had developed an almost telepathic ability to find each other in the factory's controlled chaos, drawn together by forces that seemed stronger than the war raging around them. Klaus had begun creating small works of art from factory scraps during his limited free time, tiny sculptures and delicate metalwork that he gave to Margaret as tokens of affection that transcended language barriers. Each gift represented hours of secret labor, precious time stolen from rest, to create something beautiful in a world dedicated to destruction. Margaret treasured these offerings more than any jewelry she had ever owned, hiding them in a small box beneath her bed where they served as physical proof that their impossible love was real. She began writing letters to Klaus that she never intended to send, pouring her heart onto pages that captured emotions too dangerous to speak aloud even in whispered factory conversations. The agents discovered these letters during a search of Margaret's apartment conducted while she was at work. The documents revealed the depth of her feelings for Klaus and her growing awareness that their relationship could only end in tragedy. She wrote about dreams of a life they could never share, plans for a future that war made impossible, and the daily struggle to maintain hope while understanding that their love was doomed. Klaus's artistic creations were confiscated during a surprise inspection of prisoner quarters, each piece catalogued as evidence in a case that was growing more complex with every passing day. The investigators understood that these handmade gifts represented something more than simple, romantic tokens. They were proof of emotional bonds that could compromise judgment and create loyalties that transcended national allegiance. The military command structure that oversaw prisoner operations began pressuring investigators to resolve the situation quickly, before it created precedents that could undermine security at other facilities. Klaus represented a significant investment in labor resources that the war effort could not afford to lose, while his continued presence at Willow Run posed risks that could not be ignored. Margaret's supervisors received orders to monitor her work performance more closely, looking for any signs that her emotional involvement with Klaus was affecting her ability to maintain production standards or security protocols. They found instead a worker whose dedication had actually increased as her relationship with Klaus developed. Someone who took pride in building bombers that would help end the war that kept them apart. The paradox was not lost on investigators who understood that Margaret's love for Klaus had made her a more effective contributor to America's war effort, while simultaneously making her a security risk that required immediate intervention. Love had strengthened her commitment to victory while creating vulnerabilities that hostile forces could potentially exploit. The psychological evaluations ordered for both subjects revealed individuals struggling with conflicts that went to the heart of human nature during wartime. Klaus demonstrated no signs of disloyalty to America despite his German nationality, while showing clear evidence of emotional attachment that could influence his behavior in unpredictable ways. Margaret's evaluation indicated someone experiencing genuine love for the first time in her life, an emotional awakening that had transformed her understanding of herself and her place in the world. The psychologist noted that her feelings for Klaus appeared to have strengthened rather than weakened her sense of American identity, as if loving someone from the enemy nation had clarified her own values and commitments. But psychological insights could not resolve the fundamental security dilemma that Margaret and Klaus represented. Their love story had created a situation without precedent in American military history, forcing decision-makers to choose between compassion and security in ways that would define how similar cases were handled for generations to come. The investigation was nearing its conclusion, with enough evidence gathered to support whatever action authorities decided to take. Margaret and Klaus continued their dangerous romance, unaware that each stolen moment brought them closer to a reckoning that would test everything they believed about love, loyalty, and the price of choosing hope over despair in humanity's darkest hour. The air raid sirens continued their regular testing schedule, their haunting wail echoing across Detroit's industrial landscape like a countdown to the moment when two hearts would discover whether love could survive the machinery of war or whether it would be crushed beneath the weight of a conflict that demanded absolute loyalty to causes larger than individual happiness. The moment of reckoning came on a Thursday afternoon when the factory whistle blew its emergency signal, not for an air raid drill, but for something far more personal and devastating. Margaret was installing wiring harnesses in a B-24 cockpit when she heard her name echo across the factory floor, amplified by the same public address system that announced production targets and safety warnings. Her hands froze on the electrical connections as Supervisor Henderson's voice cut through the industrial noise like a blade. She was to report immediately to the main office for what was described as a routine personnel review. But Margaret had worked at Willow Run long enough to know that nothing routine happened during peak production hours when every minute of lost labor could delay bombers bound for European skies. Klaus heard the announcement from 3 buildings away, where he was helping to install engine mounts under the watchful eyes of guards who had grown increasingly attentive over the past week. The mention of Margaret's name sent ice through his veins because he understood what such summons usually meant in the rigid hierarchy of wartime security. Someone had discovered their secret, and the reckoning they had both dreaded was finally at hand. Agent Chen watched Margaret's face drain of color as the implications of the announcement sank in. The hidden cameras had captured every micro-expression, every involuntary reaction that revealed the depth of fear that accompanied genuine guilt. This was not the response of an innocent worker surprised by routine administrative procedures. This was someone who knew exactly why she was being called away from her duties. The walk to the administrative building felt like a death march to Margaret, each step carrying her further from the factory floor where Klaus was probably wondering if he would ever see her again. The corridors that had once seemed familiar now felt hostile, lined with officials whose job was to protect America from people exactly like her. People who had chosen love over loyalty, hearts over homeland. Agent Morrison positioned himself in the observation room adjacent to the interview facility, checking recording equipment that would capture every word of what promised to be the most important interrogation of his career. The stakes went far beyond 2 individuals who had fallen in love against impossible odds. This case would establish precedents for how the United States handled romantic relationships that crossed enemy lines during wartime. Klaus found himself unable to concentrate on his assigned tasks, his hands shaking slightly as he tried to focus on mechanical procedures that required precision and attention. His fellow prisoners noticed his distraction, whispering among themselves about the German who had seemed different lately, who hummed while working and smiled at memories only he could see. Now that unusual behavior was beginning to make terrible sense. Sergeant Murphy observed Klaus's deteriorating composure with professional interest, noting how the prisoner's efficiency had dropped dramatically since the announcement echoed through the factory. This was exactly the kind of emotional vulnerability that made enemy captives dangerous, regardless of their apparent cooperation with American authorities. Love made people unpredictable, and unpredictable prisoners posed threats that could not be calculated or controlled. The interview room where Margaret found herself was deliberately austere, furnished with only a metal table and 3 chairs that emphasized the power imbalance between questioner and questioned. Agent Chen entered carrying a thick folder that contained weeks of surveillance reports, recorded conversations, and photographic evidence that would make denial impossible. Margaret's first instinct was to maintain the fiction that had protected their relationship for months, to insist that her interactions with Klaus had been purely professional and limited to work-related communication. But one look at the photographs spread across the table told her that deception was no longer possible. Images of their whispered conversations, their lingering touches, their stolen moments of connection had been captured with devastating clarity. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Pictures of Klaus creating small artworks during his off-duty hours. Documentation of Margaret's repeated requests for assignments in areas where prisoner work details operated. Transcripts of conversations that revealed emotional intimacy far beyond anything that security protocols should have allowed. Agent Chen began the interrogation with questions designed to establish the timeline of their relationship, asking Margaret to explain each photographed encounter and recorded conversation. The process was methodical and thorough, building a comprehensive picture of how two people had managed to fall in love despite every barrier that wartime security could create. Margaret found herself torn between protecting Klaus and protecting herself, understanding that anything she said could be used to justify severe punishment for both of them. She chose honesty over strategy, describing their first meeting during the machinery malfunction and the gradual development of feelings that neither had sought or expected. Her words were being transmitted directly to Klaus's interrogation, which was taking place simultaneously in another part of the administrative complex. Military intelligence officers were questioning him with the harsh efficiency of men who understood that enemy prisoners had no rights beyond those granted by Geneva Convention protocols. Klaus faced his questioners with the dignity of someone who had always known this moment would come, who had accepted the probable consequences of falling in love with an American factory worker. He refused to implicate Margaret in any wrongdoing, insisting that he had initiated their relationship and that she had done nothing beyond. Respond to his advances with basic human kindness. The parallel interrogations revealed the depth of protection each was trying to provide for the other, a mutual loyalty that impressed even hardened investigators who had seen every form of wartime deception. Neither Margaret nor Klaus attempted to minimize their own involvement while trying to shield their beloved from consequences that both understood could be severe. Agent Chen pressed Margaret for details about information Klaus might have gathered during their conversation, searching for evidence that their romance had been used as cover for intelligence operations. She found instead a woman whose love had been entirely personal, focused on the man rather than the soldier, the individual rather than the enemy national. The military officers questioning Klaus pursued similar lines of inquiry, demanding to know what factory secrets he had observed and reported during his months of contact with American personnel. Klaus's responses revealed someone who had been far more interested in Margaret's dreams and fears than in production schedules or security procedures. Both investigations reached the same conclusion by late afternoon. Margaret Sullivan and Klaus Vber had committed no acts of espionage or sabotage. They had simply fallen in love in circumstances that made such feelings a threat to national security regardless of their innocent origins. But the absence of deliberate treason did not eliminate the security risks their relationship represented. Klaus remained an enemy prisoner whose emotional attachments could be exploited by German intelligence operations. Margaret had demonstrated that her judgment could be compromised by personal feelings that superseded her loyalty to military security protocols. The decisions that followed were made at levels of authority that neither Margaret nor Klaus would ever be allowed to see or influence. Military commanders, FBI supervisors, and War Department officials weighed the precedent that would be set by whatever action they chose to take. Klaus would be transferred immediately to a maximum security facility in the Southwest, where contact with civilian workers would be impossible and where he would remain until the war's end. The transfer would happen that night, giving him no opportunity to communicate with Margaret or even say goodbye to the woman who had transformed his understanding of what it meant to be human during humanity's darkest hour. Margaret would face administrative punishment rather than criminal charges, a recognition that her actions had been motivated by love rather than malice. She would be dismissed from her position at Willow Run and barred from employment at any defense facility for the duration of the war. Her security clearance would be permanently revoked, marking her as someone whose loyalty could not be trusted in matters of national importance. The psychological evaluations that had revealed the genuine nature of their feelings also recommended that both subjects receive counseling designed to help them understand the broader implications of their choices. Love between enemies during wartime created vulnerabilities that extended far beyond individual happiness or heartbreak. Klaus received the news of his transfer with the stoic acceptance of a soldier who had always understood that his fate was not his own to determine. He was allowed to write one letter to Margaret, a final communication that would be heavily censored before delivery. In it, he tried to express gratitude for the months of happiness she had given him, and hoped that she would find the peace and love she deserved in whatever life awaited her after the war. Margaret learned of Klaus's departure through the same administrative channels that had announced her dismissal, a bureaucratic notification that reduced the most meaningful relationship of her life to a security incident requiring resolution. She was escorted from the factory that evening, her personal belongings packed into the same metal lunch pail that had once carried food to share with the man she loved. The other workers watched her departure with mixed feelings of sympathy and relief. Some understood that Margaret had done nothing more than fall in love with someone who happened to wear the wrong uniform. Others believed that wartime demanded sacrifices that included personal happiness when it conflicted with national security. Klaus's fellow prisoners were told only that he had been transferred for administrative reasons, an explanation that satisfied no one but could not be questioned without risking similar consequences. The empty bunk where he had slept became a reminder that, even in captivity, emotional connections could lead to separations that felt like death. The factory continued its relentless production schedule, churning out bombers that would carry freedom across oceans toward enemies who might include Klaus's former comrades. The machinery that had provided cover for whispered conversations of love now echoed only with the sounds of war, its rhythms unchanged by the human drama that had played out in its shadows. Margaret returned to her small apartment to find it had been searched with professional thoroughness, her private letters confiscated, and her small collection of Klaus's handmade gifts catalogued as evidence in a case that would never go to trial. The box beneath her bed was empty, its contents now residing in federal filing cabinets where they would remain classified for decades. Klaus found himself on a westbound train within hours of his interrogation, watching the industrial landscape of Detroit disappear into darkness. The other prisoners in his transport car had been selected for similar security risks, men whose behavior had somehow threatened the careful balance that kept enemy captives useful without making them dangerous. The new facility that awaited Klaus in the desert southwest was designed for prisoners who could not be trusted with the freedoms that labor assignments provided. Surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, it offered no opportunity for the kind of human connection that had flourished in the controlled chaos of Willow Run's factory floor. Margaret spent her first night of unemployment writing letters she would never send, pouring her heart onto pages that joined the growing collection of communications too dangerous to deliver. She wrote about the injustice of a system that punished love, about the waste of separating people who had found something beautiful in a world dedicated to destruction. But she also wrote about understanding, about accepting that their love had indeed created the security risks that authorities feared. Klaus's emotional attachment to her could have been exploited by enemy agents who understood that the heart was often the weakest point in even the strongest defenses. The investigation's conclusion marked the end of one chapter in their story while opening another that would test whether love could survive separation, whether connections forged in impossible circumstances could endure when those circumstances changed completely. The weeks that followed their separation felt like a slow-motion catastrophe for both Margaret and Klaus, each day stretching endlessly as they grappled with the reality that their love story had become a cautionary tale whispered in the corridors of America's war machine. Margaret found herself waking each morning to the absence of purpose that had once driven her from bed before dawn. The factory whistle that had called her to duty now serving only as a painful reminder of everything she had lost. Her small apartment, which had once felt like a sanctuary between shifts, now seemed like a prison where memories of Klaus haunted every corner. The chair where she had sat writing letters to him. The window where she had stood imagining his face in the morning light. The bed where she had dreamed of a future that war made impossible. Each familiar object carried the weight of what might have been, transforming her home into a museum of shattered hopes. The dismissal letter from Willow Run arrived on official War Department stationery, its formal language unable to disguise the finality of decisions made in offices she would never see by officials whose names she would never know. Margaret read the document multiple times, searching for some hint that appeals might be possible, that explanations might matter, that the love she felt for Klaus could somehow be weighed against the security concerns that had destroyed their world. But bureaucracy recognized no appeals from the heart, offered no provisions for emotions that crossed enemy lines, provided no mercy for people who had chosen connection over the carefully maintained hatred that fueled America's war effort. Margaret Sullivan was now a security risk, marked for life as someone whose judgment could not be trusted when personal feelings conflicted with national interests. Klaus faced his own adjustment to a reality that felt designed to crush whatever remained of his spirit after months of finding hope in impossible circumstances. The detention facility in Arizona was a monument to the principle that enemy prisoners must be contained, not just physically, but emotionally, prevented from forming the kinds of human connections that might compromise their status as defeated enemies. The barracks where he now lived housed men who had been transferred for similar infractions, prisoners whose behavior had somehow threatened the delicate balance that made enemy captives useful without making them dangerous. Some had been caught attempting escapes. Others had shown signs of organizing resistance activities. A few, like Klaus, had committed the unforgivable sin of falling in love with someone on the wrong side of history's greatest conflict. The daily routine at the new facility was designed to occupy every moment of consciousness with activities that left no time for the kind of reflection that might breed dangerous thoughts. Physical labor that served no productive purpose, educational sessions that emphasized German military failures, and recreational activities monitored so closely that genuine human interaction became nearly impossible. Klaus found himself assigned to road construction projects in the desert, back-breaking work performed under the harsh Arizona sun that left him too exhausted for the dreams that had sustained him during his months at Willow Run. The landscape around him was alien and hostile, nothing like the industrial environment where he had discovered what it meant to love someone completely despite every rational argument against such feelings. His fellow prisoners were men broken in different ways by their separation from everything that had given their lives meaning. Some had lost families to Allied bombing raids. Others faced the prospect of returning to homelands that might no longer exist. All carried the weight of understanding that the war which had brought them to America would eventually end, but the consequences of that ending remained unknowable and terrifying. Margaret attempted to find new employment that would allow her to contribute to the war effort while supporting herself in a city that had become expensive beyond the reach of most civilian wages. But her dismissal from Willow Run had created a record that followed her to every defense plant, every government office, every facility where her skills might have been useful to America's victory. The security clearance revocation that had seemed like an administrative detail during her interrogation now revealed itself as a professional death sentence that made her unemployable in the very industries where women were desperately needed. Margaret discovered that love could transform someone from a valued contributor to America's war machine into an untouchable whose very presence threatened the security that victory required. She found work eventually in a civilian job that paid a fraction of her factory wages, assembling children's toys in a small workshop that operated far from the strategic industries where her experience might have made a difference. The irony was not lost on her that she now spent her days creating playthings while the man she loved performed manual labor designed to break his spirit in preparation for an uncertain future. The letters Klaus had been allowed to write before his transfer were subjected to censorship so thorough that Margaret received only fragments of his thoughts, sentences edited to remove any reference to feelings that might compromise security or hope that might sustain dangerous connections. What reached her were glimpses of a man trying to communicate love through language that had been stripped of everything that made love recognizable. Margaret's own attempts to correspond with Klaus met with official silence that was more devastating than outright rejection would have been. Her letters disappeared into bureaucratic channels designed to prevent exactly the kind of communication that might maintain emotional bonds across the carefully constructed barriers that separated enemy prisoners from American civilians. The isolation that both experienced was more complete than physical separation could explain. They had been cut off not just from each other, but from the identities they had discovered during their months of stolen conversations in factory shadows. Margaret was no longer the woman who had found courage to love someone the world called enemy. Klaus was no longer the man who had discovered that humanity could survive even the dehumanizing machinery of modern warfare. The psychological counseling that had been recommended for both proved to be another form of imprisonment. Sessions with mental health professionals whose job was to help them understand why their feelings had been dangerous and how they might avoid similar emotional mistakes in the future. The counselors meant well, but they operated within frameworks that could not acknowledge the possibility that love between enemies might represent something more valuable than the security it threatened. Margaret's sessions focused on helping her understand how her marriage to a man she had never loved had created vulnerabilities that German prisoner Klaus had exploited, whether consciously or unconsciously. The possibility that her feelings might have been genuine, that Klaus might have been equally innocent of manipulation, could not be entertained because it suggested that the security apparatus had punished people for emotions beyond their control. Klaus's counseling emphasized the ways his emotional attachment to an American civilian had made him a potential asset for enemy intelligence operations, regardless of his conscious intentions or actual behavior. The counselors explained how his feelings for Margaret could have been used against him by German agents who understood that the heart was often the weakest point in even the strongest defenses. Both forms of treatment shared the assumption that love between enemies during wartime was inherently pathological, a deviation from healthy emotional responses that required correction rather than understanding. The idea that two people might genuinely care for each other across the artificial boundaries that war created was too dangerous to acknowledge, too threatening to the psychological frameworks that made total war psychologically possible. The months stretched into seasons as Margaret and Klaus adapted to lives that felt like extended mourning periods for relationships that had been declared dead by authorities who could not afford to recognize their legitimacy. Both learned to perform the routines of their new circumstances while preserving inner spaces where memories of their impossible love could survive official disapproval and systematic discouragement. Margaret's work at the toy factory became a meditation on the innocence that war destroyed, her hands assembling playthings while her mind wandered to the man who was probably breaking rocks in desert heat thousands of miles away. Each toy she completed represented a child who might grow up in a world where love between former enemies would be possible, where the barriers that had separated her from Klaus might finally crumble. Klaus found meaning in the meaningless labor assigned to prisoners whose spirits needed breaking, using road construction as an opportunity to build something useful, even if the work was intended as punishment. Each stone he placed, each section of roadway he helped create, became a small act of rebellion against systems designed to reduce human beings to categories of useful or dangerous. The other workers in Margaret's factory gradually learned fragments of her story, whispered accounts of the woman who had lost everything for loving someone she was supposed to hate. Some viewed her with suspicion, wondering what kind of person could betray her country for romance. Others saw her as a victim of circumstances beyond anyone's control, someone who had paid too high a price for feelings that might have been beautiful in a different world. Klaus's fellow prisoners created their own informal support networks, men who understood that survival required maintaining hope despite every effort to crush it. They shared stories of home, dreams of return, and sometimes the memories of connections that had made their captivity bearable before security concerns separated them from whatever had given their imprisonment meaning. The war continued its relentless progress toward conclusions that remained unclear to everyone except the highest levels of military command. News filtered into both Margaret's civilian life and Klaus's prison routine through carefully controlled channels that revealed enough to maintain morale while concealing information that might compromise security or encourage dangerous hope. Margaret followed reports of Allied advances across Europe with conflicted emotions, understanding that every victory brought the end of Klaus's imprisonment closer, while also moving him toward repatriation to a homeland that might no longer exist. The liberation she had once prayed for now felt like another form of separation, an ending that would carry Klaus beyond any possibility of reunion. Klaus learned of German, defeats through prison announcements designed to reinforce his status as a member of a losing cause, but he interpreted the news differently than his captors intended. Each Allied victory represented progress toward a world where the artificial divisions that had separated him from Margaret might finally be swept away by peace. The administrative machinery that had torn them apart continued operating with the same efficient indifference that characterized all wartime bureaucracy, processing other cases of security breaches and emotional complications with the same systematic thoroughness that had destroyed their relationship. Margaret and Klaus had become precedents, examples cited in training manuals that taught security personnel how to recognize and eliminate the human connections that could compromise military effectiveness. Their love story lived on in classified files and whispered warnings, a cautionary tale that demonstrated why emotional attachments between enemies could not be tolerated regardless of their apparent innocence or genuine nature. The bureaucrats who had separated them moved on to other cases, other threats, other examples of how personal feelings could compromise the collective effort that victory required. But somewhere in the vast machinery of America's war effort, two hearts continued beating with memories of what they had found in the shadows of Willow Run's factory floor, carrying forward the possibility that love might somehow survive the systematic efforts to destroy it, that connection might prove stronger than the forces designed to prevent it. That hope might endure even when separated by distances that seemed impossible to bridge. The air raid sirens continued their regular testing schedule across Detroit, their haunting wail now serving as requiem for a love story that had briefly illuminated the darkness of humanity's greatest conflict before being extinguished by the very machinery it had dared to challenge. The spring of 1944 brought changes to both their worlds that neither Margaret nor Klaus could have anticipated. Margaret had found work at a small manufacturing plant on Detroit's east side, assembling radio components for military communications equipment. The work paid less than half her Willow Run wages, but it allowed her to contribute something meaningful to the war effort while keeping her hands busy during the long hours when memories of Klaus threatened to overwhelm her completely. Her new co-workers were mostly older women whose sons or husbands served overseas, creating an atmosphere of shared sacrifice that made Margaret's situation feel both understood and impossibly unique. These women had lost loved ones to enemy fire, watched their boys march off to fight against people like Klaus. Yet somehow, their maternal instincts recognized the genuine grief in Margaret's eyes, even if they could never fully comprehend its source. The radio components she assembled would carry voices across battlefields where Klaus's former comrades might still be fighting for a cause he had already abandoned in his heart. Each circuit board became a meditation on communication, on the human need to reach across impossible distances to touch another soul. Margaret found herself wondering whether any of the radios she built might somehow carry her voice to the man she had been forbidden to contact. Klaus, meanwhile, was discovering that the Arizona desert possessed its own brutal beauty, landscapes that stretched endlessly toward horizons that seemed to mock human dreams of connection. The road construction crews worked 12-hour shifts under supervision that was both constant and deliberately humiliating, designed to reinforce their status as defeated enemies whose value lay only in their capacity for physical labor. The work was backbreaking and purposeless. Roads that led nowhere important, built according to specifications that seemed designed more to occupy prisoners than to serve any meaningful transportation needs. Yet Klaus found ways to take pride in the quality of his craftsmanship, smoothing stone surfaces and aligning drainage channels with the precision of someone who understood that even forced labor could become an expression of human dignity. His fellow prisoners were men from across the German military hierarchy, officers and enlisted personnel thrown together by the democratic leveling effect of captivity. Some maintained rigid military discipline even in imprisonment, clinging to rank structures that no longer meant anything. Others had embraced the philosophical freedom that came with having nothing left to lose except their lives. Klaus gravitated toward the philosophers and dreamers, men who spent their limited free time discussing literature, theology, and the possibility of redemption in a world that had seemingly forgotten the meaning of mercy. These conversations became lifelines to sanity, intellectual connections that helped preserve the humanity that systematic dehumanization was designed to destroy. The letters he had been writing to Margaret in his mind grew longer and more elaborate as the months passed, imaginary communications that preserved their relationship in the only space where it could still exist safely. He composed poetry that captured the colors of desert sunsets, descriptions of landscapes that might somehow convey the beauty he wished he could share with her across the thousands of miles that separated them. Margaret's own imaginary letters to Klaus became a form of prayer, daily conversations with someone who might no longer remember her face, but whose memory sustained her through the ordinary cruelties of life as a security risk in wartime America. She told him about the changing seasons in Detroit, about spring flowers that reminded her of the hope they had once shared in factory shadows. The investigation that had destroyed their relationship continued generating paperwork long after their separation, reports, and analyses that filtered through bureaucratic channels designed to extract lessons from their case. Military psychologists studied their relationship as an example of how enemy prisoners might exploit American emotional vulnerabilities, while counterintelligence experts used their story to develop new protocols for preventing similar security breaches. Neither Margaret nor Klaus appeared in these analyses as human beings capable of genuine feeling, but rather as data points in larger studies of wartime psychology and security vulnerabilities. Their love had been reduced to a case study, their emotions transformed into evidence of systemic weaknesses that required systematic correction. The factory where Margaret now worked received regular visits from security personnel who monitored employee activities with the paranoid attention that had become standard throughout American industry. These inspections served as constant reminders that her previous lapse in judgment had marked her as someone requiring permanent surveillance, a potential threat whose past mistakes could not be forgotten or forgiven. Her supervisor, Mrs. Patterson, was a widow whose husband had died at Pearl Harbor, creating a personal stake in victory that made her initially suspicious of any employee with a questionable security record. But weeks of observing Margaret's dedication to her work and obvious commitment to American victory gradually softened her attitude towards someone who seemed to be paying a disproportionate price for the crime of falling in love with the wrong person. Klaus found similar unexpected allies among the guards who supervised his work details, men whose initial hostility gradually gave way to grudging respect for a prisoner who never complained, never caused trouble, and performed even the most meaningless tasks with professional competence. Some of these guards were veterans of the First War who understood that enemy soldiers could be decent people trapped by circumstances beyond their control. Sergeant Williams, who supervised Klaus's road crew, had fought in France during 1918 and carried memories of German prisoners who had helped American medics treat wounded soldiers from both sides. His experience had taught him to distinguish between fanatics who deserved harsh treatment and ordinary men who happened to wear the wrong uniform when history's wheel turned against them. The changing seasons brought news of Allied victories that made the war's end seem increasingly inevitable, though the timeline remained unclear to everyone except the highest levels of military command. Margaret followed these developments with the conflicted emotions of someone who wanted American victory, while fearing what peace might mean for any possibility of reunion with Klaus. Klaus received war news through prison announcements that emphasized German defeats while providing no information about what would happen to prisoners when hostilities finally ended. Some of his fellow captives spoke optimistically about repatriation to rebuilt homelands where they could resume interrupted lives. Others feared return to countries that might no longer exist, to families who might have perished in the bombing campaigns that were systematically destroying German cities. The uncertainty about post-war futures created a strange form of limbo, where planning became impossible and hope required faith in possibilities that seemed increasingly remote. Margaret could not imagine how she might contact Klaus after his repatriation, assuming he survived imprisonment and returned to a homeland that was being systematically devastated by the very bombers she had helped build at Willow Run. Klaus faced similar uncertainties about whether Margaret would remember him after the war ended and normal life resumed, whether the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them together would seem less meaningful when viewed from the perspective of peacetime stability. Their love had been forged in crisis, sustained by danger, and defined by impossibility. How could it survive in a world where such obstacles no longer existed? The psychological counseling sessions continued for both, though their effectiveness remained questionable. Margaret's counselor, Dr. Henderson, was a well-meaning professional who genuinely wanted to help her process the trauma of losing someone she loved. But his theoretical framework could not accommodate the possibility that her feelings for Klaus might have been healthy expressions of human connection rather than pathological responses to wartime stress. Klaus's counseling focused on helping him understand how his emotional attachment to an American civilian had compromised his effectiveness as a prisoner of war, though the counselors could never clearly explain what that effectiveness was supposed to entail. The sessions became elaborate exercises in circular reasoning that assumed his feelings were inappropriate while never quite explaining why love itself could be considered a security threat. Both Margaret and Klaus learned to navigate these sessions by providing the responses their counselors wanted to hear while preserving their authentic emotions in private spaces that professional intervention could not reach. They became skilled at performing recovery while maintaining the internal connections that made survival possible. The administrative machinery that had separated them continued operating with characteristic efficiency, processing new cases of security breaches and emotional complications that arose wherever enemy prisoners worked alongside American civilians. Margaret and Klaus had established precedents that influenced how similar situations were handled, their love story becoming a template for recognizing and eliminating dangerous human connections. The story of Margaret Sullivan and Klaus Vber reminds us that even in humanity's darkest hours, love finds ways to bloom in the most impossible circumstances. Their forbidden romance, discovered in the shadows of America's greatest war machine, proves that the human heart recognizes no boundaries when it encounters another soul in need of connection. Though separated by forces beyond their control, their brief time together illuminated something profound about our capacity to choose compassion over hatred, even when the world demands we see enemies instead of fellow human beings. Sometimes, the most important victories happen not on battlefields, but in quiet moments when two people dare to love across the artificial divisions that war creates.